Before I get into the details about this amazing village in Rio Dulce, Guatemala, I'm going to briefly discuss about why and how we went to Guatemala. We are a group of 7 college students from the University of Maine at Prescal. We were looking to help somebody that was in true need, and we found a remote village in Rio Dulce, Guatemala. As a group, we collectively decided on what we were going to do once we arrived in Guatemala. We decided that we would place concrete floors in their thatched houses, teach basic English skills, bring necessary hygiene products for the kids and the other residents of the village, and also bring over 2 dozen soccer balls so we could play soccer with the kids. Like most things in our world, it costs money to do things. In our case, it was going to cost us over $18,000 to go to Guatemala and do what we wanted to do with the kids and the village. So, through local charities and communication and collaboration through local resources, we were able to raise over $24,000 before we had to leave in March of 2013. Like any international traveler, I did research on where I was going and the language that the country speaks. In Guatemala, they primarily speak Spanish, so for several months I prepared basic Spanish skills to communicate with the villagers and to be able to communicate with my students when I was teaching them English. After a day's worth of traveling and trekking through the jungle, we finally reached the village of Nacimiento outside of Rio Dulce, Guatemala. That is where we would find the community that would change my view on society and how we collaborate with each other and how we communicate with each other. Once I got into Nacimiento, I soon figured out that they do not speak Spanish. They speak a Maya language called Chiache. When I asked the guide that brought us into Nacimiento why the villagers did not speak Spanish, he continued to explain to me due to the remoteness of the village and the seclusiveness of its people, their government did not know that they even existed until 2003. And when they did recognize that they were actually legitimately there, they had to translate everything from the Mayan calendar and the Mayan language over into Spanish so they could give them birth certificates and ID cards. While absorbing all the beauty in the village and the culture that was around, it kind of hit me all of a sudden that my lesson plans were no longer effective due to the kids not knowing Spanish or minimal Spanish, and that they actually speak a Mayan language called Chiache. So I began a quest to find myself a translator who could speak Chiache, Spanish, and somewhat English. Come to find out, it was a little boy named Julio, and he will be my translator for the entire duration of my stay. As Julio is showing me around his village and showing me to his friends, he sits me down and starts speaking Spanish to me. I try to communicate back, and then he asks me in Spanish if I can speak Chiache. I tell him no. So he begins to teach me by holding each one of my fingers, going 1 for hoon, 2 for kip, and 3 for oh shit. I'm not going to lie, when he said that one, it took me back as a cultural difference, and then I had to clear up with him a couple times number 3, and we continued on to 9, and I'm going to tell you, those numbers are quite hard. As Julio begins to teach me my numbers in Chiache, he also starts grabbing up other objects around him and saying things in Spanish and then in Chiache so I can learn what the object is in their native language, which I thought was a really cool thing for a child to just grab something and be like, I want to teach you my native language because I am that proud of where I come from. So after the first initial day and the big hoopla of the new people, or the gringos as they called us, came to the village, I went back and I sat down with some of my friends and I was like, I don't know if I can actually teach them English because I prepared for Spanish. They don't speak Spanish, they speak Chiache. That means I'm trilingually teaching them a language, and I don't know if I have that kind of capability. For the first several days, we put in the concrete floors and we weren't doing the basic English teaching classes. which was amazing because that gave me time to redesign and refigure out how I was going to make a trilingual ESL class that I did not prepare for, and also try to learn some of their language so I could communicate with them, which was very hard because it's very tonal and there are actual clicking noises that they do in the back of their throat. Thankfully, the academic advisor that had come with us to this mission trip to Guatemala was the head of the educational department. And so I brought up my concerns to him, and he was like, "Well, how do you kids learn language?" And I said, "Well, it's usually just shown or and pointed to and explained this is this." And he goes, "That is no different than teaching a kid that you thought spoke Spanish than teaching a kid that speaks Chieche. You just have to go point at it and say Chieche, Espanol, then English. And then it will make sense to them because they're seeing the transition of the object in the language that they have reference to." So, taking the educational advice from the head of the Department of Education at the university, I went in the next day. It was the first day of basic English class, and I literally took off my shoe. I smelt it, made this nasty face, and I point at it. The kids laughed, and I said Chieche. They said it in Chieche. I said Espanol. They said it in Espanol, and then I said it in English. And then I kept referring things back to it. Go Chieche, Espanol, Anglais, and the kids were actually learning, and it was an amazing feeling to teach somebody that speaks a native language such as that, and then also teach them a secondary European language, then on to English, and then they're actually understanding what you're doing because you're just breaking it down to the most basic levels that people can understand, and you're not being disrespectful, and also you're getting the respect of the people by learning something that is truly theirs. It's their own personal gift to the world that nobody can take away. Depending on the community that you're teaching in and living in will really depend on your diversity makeup in your classroom. So, what do we do when we encounter an ESL student or a parent or guardian that doesn't speak English? Thankfully, we live in the 21st century, and information is literally at our fingertips at a day to day basis. Between our cell phones and our tablets and our computers all connected to the internet, we have an endless supply of tools that can help us when we encounter situations like having an ESL student or a parent or guardian that doesn't speak English. So, what do we do when we encounter a student that's an ESL student or a parent or guardian that is limited in English or doesn't speak English at all? Foremost, we must remember that we provide an equity of education when we make our decisions. Let's address the situation that we have a student that has a parent or guardian that has very limited English abilities or doesn't speak it at all and can't read it, and we need them to sign very important paperwork such as immunization records, medical records, food forms, etc. At the beginning of the school year kind of forms that need to be done. So, how are we going to be sure that they're going to understand the paperwork and what is going to be asked of them to provide to the school department? So, we can do a simple thing is go to Google Translate and type in the language that you need and translate the English forms over to the language that you need. I would advise to staple an English form and the language form that you need together and put stickies where they need to sign on the English form and on their foreign language one. And this makes them feel included. They don't feel like, okay, they're not just throwing a whole bunch of English at me and I'm an immigrant and that I feel like I'm being taken advantage of, or any kind of scenario where they are feeling overwhelmed and they don't feel like they can come to the school. This provides like an open door policy saying, we understand that you don't speak English or you're struggling to speak English, but we're here for you and your student, their child. And let's also now discuss maybe that you need to have a meeting with this parent and you're really not sure on how you're going to communicate. So there's very simple things on your phone that can alleviate this problem. So you can download Google Translate. Google Translate does have an audio. Just be aware if you use Google Translate and they're speaking in a very colloquial sense, it might not translate what they're saying correctly and it might come up as a misinterpretation. Another way you can handle this situation is that every phone that is a smartphone has an international keyboard list. You can literally go right into your general settings, go right to the keyboard, and select the language that you need, and it'll add the language keyboard to it. It'll end up showing as a world atlas on your keyboard when you pop up, and if you hit it, it will switch into that foreign language, so the accents are there and stuff like that. So if the verbal Google Translate is not really working and you're having a hard time trying to still communicate, you can use the written portion as long as they know how to write in their native language and have it translated from their native language over to you, and you can do it right back through English to your native language. And again, all of these things are really free. And at the end of the day, it shows the parent or guardian that you really respect them and value that their child is here, and that you're not just trying to yell at them in English to make them understand it better, and you'll end up collaborating together to foster a better success for their child academically, socially, and help them integrate into American society much better than isolating them and trying to force them to read and write and speaking English right away as they come into the country. So let's address the situation that we have an ESL student in our classroom, and let's say, for the sake of it, he speaks Spanish. Now, as a teacher, we now have to think, what are the services and accommodations that we must provide for this student so he or she can be successful academically, socially, and so forth. Depending on the community that you're working in and living in, will determine if you'll have access to an ESL teacher. If you have access to an ESL teacher, then that child will have a support system within that classroom, and most of the accommodations and services will be provided through that ESL teacher. Now, let's say if you don't come from a very diverse community and you need to figure out what are you going to do to provide an equity of education to this ESL student. One way to do this is to find an edtech that speaks the language that the student does. So let's say your community and your school department is not very diverse and you cannot find an ed tech that has language abilities or can speak the language that that student speaks, because you never know, you might get a refugee in your community and you have nobody that in your community that speaks Arabic, and you need to be able to communicate with this child. Again, so if we don't have access to that foreign language speaking ed tech available in our school department, another resource that we can look to use to help the student translate from whatever language that he's learning into English is Rosetta Stone. Communicate with your school department, express the need of this student. Usually in the budget, there's something for the school department to spend $300 for the student to be able to learn English and to alleviate some of that pressure off of you. Another way to address the needs of the ESL student is to go to your department head, administration, school board, whoever you have to go to access funds to obtain books that you might need, classes that you would like to attend, or even getting Rosetta Stone for yourself for that language so you can be able to communicate with the student. I find it personally quite useful to be able to communicate with a student that has ESL needs in the language that is their native tongue, because that allows them to feel like they're a part of the class, they're not an outsider, and it shows that you're trying to communicate them, and it helps build that student-teacher relationship that is so important in classroom dynamics to have with a student, especially a student with ESL needs. Thank you for listening, and I hope you found my video informative, useful, and helpful when encountering a student with ESL needs or a parent or guardian that has limited English abilities.